Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, all protocols observed. My name is Hilda Vukikomwala, representative of the Pacific Youth Council and a staff member here at USP, and it is with great pleasure that I welcome you all to this auspicious occasion, the Youth Action for Climate Change interactive discussion with you, Secretary General of the United Nations. Today on our panel, to my far right, we have Chofiliti Vekoso from Save the Children Fiji. Beside Chofiliti is Zakia Ali, USP student who also recently presented at the Pacific Resilience Meeting. On my far right, we have Ruthie. On my far left, thank you, Secretary General. On my far left, we have Ruthie Senikula, Program Officer for Youth at the Pacific Disability Forum, and right beside me here is Nikhil Prasad from Project Survival Pacific. And of course, our final panelist on my right needs no introduction, Mr. Guterres. This afternoon, we are here to discuss climate change and how it affects youths and the most vulnerable groups in our societies. We will begin with a brief panel dialogue with our panelists here, followed by further discussion once the floor is open. So please feel free to state a comment or pose a question once the floor is open. I now invite Secretary General for opening remarks.
Dear friends, all protocol observed, it's an enormous pleasure to be here with all of you, and especially talking to the students at this university to say how badly those that are responsible for most of the decisions taken in the world, coming from my generation, how badly we need your intervention, because we are not doing the job. Climate change is running faster than what we are. We are seeing that what is happening in the world is worse than the most dramatic predictions that were made. The 4 last years were the 4 hottest on record. The level of concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is as high as 3 million years ago. It has never been as high since 3 million years ago. And we are seeing record levels, both in relation to the increase of temperature around the world and in the waters. We are seeing record levels in the sea rising, and we are seeing record levels in the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It's true that we had the Paris Agreement, and for many, this was this idea, we reached an agreement in Paris, that's done, let's move forward. The problem is, we are now totally knowledgeable because the scientific community has been, I would say, 99.9% in agreement that we cannot let temperatures increase by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius at the end of the century in relation to the starting point. We are already above 1 degree. Now, for that to be possible, we need to be able, according to the scientific community, to be carbon neutral in 2050. And the problem is that the emissions are still going up. In the last 2 years, the emissions went up again after a small lull during 2 or 3 years before. And the truth is that we are seeing a paradox. Things are getting worse on the ground. We see storms that are more devastating everywhere. We see drought progressing in some areas of the world in ways that are pushing for conflict and for the displacement of people. We see glaciers melting, corals bleaching, the Arctic in big trouble. We see even the Antarctica and Greenland starting to melt, and that, of course, from the point of view of the sea level is the most devastating perspective. Things are getting worse than expected, but the political will has been fading. And so, not only what was agreed in Paris we fixed a goal, 2 degrees, or not more than 2 degrees, as close as possible to 1.5. After that, the scientific community came with the so-called IPCC, and they said, no, it's 1.5, because more than that will be catastrophic. But what was agreed in Paris beyond that was just the different commitments made by the different countries. Based on the commitments made in Paris, we would reach more than 3 degrees at the end of the century. So we need stronger commitments. And worse than that, the commitments are not being met. So we are not on track even to reach what was agreed in Paris. And as we are not on track, we need to have a transformational change in our world, in energy, in industry, in agriculture, in mobility, and we are going too slowly. The truth is that the technology is on our side. Renewable energy is now cheaper than the energy produced by coal or by oil. And we see more and more that the green economy is the most profitable, is the economy of the future. But the political will is slow. We still have lack of carbon pricing. We still have trillions of US dollars in subsidies to fossil fuels. And we are still building coal-based energy power plants in big numbers in the world. Which means that my generation is not doing it. Those that have political responsibilities in my generation are not being able to respond to the huge challenge that we face. And we need to shake it up. We need to shake things up. And we are trying our best. My visit to the Pacific is essentially to express solidarity, naturally. And the Pacific is in the front line of the negative impacts of climate change and is not contributing to climate change because, of course, the emissions here are very low. So there is a dimension of solidarity. But the main reason to come here is to agitate, is to make noise, and is to convince countries that they need to do more in the run-up for the summit that I convened in September, and especially in the run-up for the new so-called national determined contributions, which is the jargon that means the engagement of member states that need to be renewed in 2020. So this visit is a visit to, it's sounding an alarm. But beyond that, what for me is clear is, and it is my biggest hope, is that I see the young people everywhere in the world telling the adults, look, you are misbehaving. This planet will be, of course, yours, but will be more ours in the future. And what you are doing is ruining the possibilities of a healthy planet for our generation. And we've seen lots of very important movements all around the world in which the youth has been clearly active. And I think active at different levels. One is the political level. When you had these strikes and these movements, it's clearly to push the public opinion to be engaged and tell the politicians, you need to change. This cannot go on. But I also have seen in many of my meetings with friends, the young people telling the parents, you cannot behave like that. Why have you got a car that is so powerful when you can have a much cheaper and less polluting one? Why do you eat so much red meat and knowing that CH4 is one of the problems of climate change? And I see the young people telling the adults what they need to do in order for us to be able to meet the goal. And the goal is very simple. Not more than 1.5 degrees at the end of the century. Carbon neutrality in 2030. Which means no more coal-fired power plants. Which means no more subsidies to fossil fuels. Which means a transformational approach to agriculture, to industry, to all the other sectors. And we need to be able to put pressure for governments to understand that they need to deliver. And I count a lot on your generation to help my generation to start behaving properly.
Thank you, Secretary General. We'll have a few remarks from the other panelists before asking you to provide reflections afterwards. So, Nikhil, Can you tell us all a little bit about how Pacific youth are engaging in discussions and decision-making on climate change on the global level?
Thank you, Hilda. Well, when I was in Poland at COP24 in the youth session with Mr. Guterres, alongside Greta and 30 other youths from around the globe, I focused majorly on the small island developing states representation at the international climate spaces, because this is the smallest number of youths from the global south that get the opportunity to engage in such podiums, even though they're the most affected by climate change. To continue with that intervention, I can say that there are many successful examples around the world on how youths from small island developing states are bringing successful examples and solutions to tackle climate change and other environmental crises, which is a concern to all of us. For example, Project Survival Pacific last year organized a local conference of youth supported by United Nations, which was a youth-led conference, 100% youth-led, that focused on key climate thematic areas and education of important conventions such as the Paris Agreement. In addition to that, we have Pacific youths who have also been involved in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change processes, such as the COP conferences. However, at the end of the day, there are not enough Pacific youths on the global stage. My final words are that more climate finance needs to be allocated towards opportunities for youths from the small island developing states to be represented at international podiums to address climate crisis at a large scale, such as your Climate Action Summit, sir, which is going to be at New York this September, as well as the COP25 conference, which is going to be in Chile. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikhil. Secretary General, following from Nikhil's examples of youth forums, in this very room the week before last was the Pacific Resilience Youth Forum, where youths from across the Pacific region gathered to discuss climate change and issues pertinent to our region. Chofiliti read the outcomes document for that event. Chofiliti, could you share with us your experience at the Youth Forum as well as the key points of the outcomes document?
Thank you, Hilda. Yes, indeed. 2 weeks ago, in this very room, we had young people from the Pacific gathered for the Pacific Resilience Youth Forum. Amazingly, young people were talking about the amazing work that they're doing in the countries they represented, the organizations they work for, the communities that they live in, and the youth groups that they are part of as well. The theme on the Pacific Resilience Youth Meeting was on youth futures in a resilient Pacific. Young people were actually pushing for the framework for resilient development in the Pacific for young people to be actively involved. Now, this is a framework that looks at integrating adaptation, risk reduction into climate change and disasters. Young people here were calling out to our leaders that young people need to be recognized. They need to be recognized for the work that they've done. They need to be also empowered, and they're also seen as agents of change. How can we achieve a 2030 agenda, the FRDP, the Sustainable Development Goals? We cannot leave our young people behind. We need to put them to make them be part of the processes, decision-making, policy-making. We need to bring them in forums, in spaces where they can freely talk about what are the real issues that they're facing at a community level when they're combating this climate crisis. These is the spaces that young people need. Funding opportunities, youth-led activities. We're talking about leaving no one behind. Remember, there's nothing about us without us. Thank you.
Thank you, Chofiliti. I love how that strong message of nothing about us without us comes from the Youth Forum and the importance of partnership and inclusivity. Zakia, as a young feminist and a young woman here at USP, what is your take on women as a vulnerable group affected by climate change?
Thank you, Hilda. I think I concur with Greta Thunberg when she says that it's no longer about the climate just changing. What's facing us is the most alarming challenge of our time. It is an ecological breakdown. It is a climate crisis. And while it affects everyone, it has a greater impact on ethnic minorities, on indigenous people, on the LGBTQI, on youth, on the poor. And when we talk about the poor, 70% are women. Now, in the Pacific, as a result of cultural norms, traditionally, women have been primary gatherers and producers of food. They source fuel, they collect water. With extreme weather conditions, with floods, with droughts, food sources are becoming unpredictable, which means women are disproportionately affected. And this further exacerbates our existing social inequalities, which means more barriers, limited access to knowledge, to resources. So, as young women, how do we adapt to the effects of the climate crisis if we don't know how to? How do we mitigate its effects? Now, women make half the global world population, almost 52%, which means it is imperative that climate action takes into account our perspectives, our needs. And to that effect, and this is where intersectionality comes in, indigenous Pacific women have been battling the impacts of the climate crisis for years, which means they have the knowledge, they have the experiences which they can contribute to mitigation actions, to adaptation actions. When solutions to disasters, when solutions to the climate crisis are formulated in response to the lived realities of these people, they are more effective. And that's what we want. We want to change this passive narrative where we are vulnerable victims to one where we are active as first responders, where we are active as leaders in disaster risk reduction, in policy spaces, in advocacy spaces, in leadership roles. Because when we employ a holistic approach, when we employ a gender-responsive approach, we are formulating solutions that are just, that are equitable, that are effective, that are sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Zakia. I completely agree with you when you say that climate change is the most alarming challenge of our time. And though it does have a greater impact on certain groups of people, it undoubtedly affects all of us. Ruthie, as Program Officer for Youth at the Pacific Disability Forum, could you briefly share with us how climate change affects persons with disabilities in the Pacific?
Thank you, Hilda. In a research that was conducted in 18 of the Pacific Island countries in the region, it was found out that 17% of the total population make up persons with disabilities, and that is a huge number. And we know that disasters and humanitarian crises affect people differently. And when we talk about persons with disabilities, and for the purpose of this gathering, youths with disabilities, the effects double, triple, and even escalate through the roof, if you like. But that is the truth. Given the common issues of food shortages, access to quality education and health, access to livelihood programs, etc., I would like to share with us 3 key challenges that youths with disabilities face in disaster. 1, accessibility. Youths with disabilities lacking access to quality goods and services during and after disasters. 2, humanitarian services during the different phases of disaster are not accessible to youths with disabilities. And 3, disability-specific needs of youths with disabilities are not part of humanitarian response. And when I say disability-specific needs, I'm referring to assistive devices, medical consumables, medication, diapers for adults, etc. So, as a youth advocate, I believe that it is crucial to empower youths with disabilities to promote inclusiveness and equality so that their voices are heard and barriers to inclusion are minimized. And I would like to echo a sentiment from the Ondaka Keeper of Faith, Chief Oren Lyons, where he said, and I quote, Although we travel in different boats, you in your boat and we in our canoe, we share the same river of life, unquote. And I believe that empowering youths with disabilities in the different phases of disaster risk management will also develop their capacities to become agents of change and be contributing citizens to our beloved Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruby. Secretary General, would you like to provide brief remarks on what the panelists have stated? We'd love to hear your perspective.
I will focus on one question that I think is essential, which is the question of empowerment. Starting by gender. We live in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture. We are, in the United Nations, now determined to achieve gender parity. And we consider that gender parity is a very important tool to make sure that women have the capacity to contribute effectively to the solution of the problems of our planet. And it is obvious that the way political systems are organized, the way societies are organized all over the world, it's not only in the Pacific, it is still a way in which the capacity of women to express their positions and to act and interfere with the decision-making processes is still too limited. And that is bad. That is bad because it is proven that when we have a system in which gender equality is fully respected, decisions are better taken, and not only decisions are better taken, but the full potential of humankind can be used. So there is a fundamental question here, and that is the empowerment of women, the empowerment of young people, the empowerment of people with disability. The biggest problem in relation to empowerment is that the experience in history shows that very few occasions, power was given. Normally, power needs to be taken. And that is why it is so important that women organizations, youth organizations, people with disability organizations act, strengthen themselves, and have a louder and louder voice, interfere more strongly with political systems, and create the conditions to reverse the power trends in which, obviously, the present situation would never allow them to play fully their rights of citizenship. And what is dramatic is that the consequences of climate change, as the consequences of conflict, as the consequences of the violation of human rights, are always more dramatic for the poor, for the vulnerable, for the discriminated. And so it is extremely important that the empowerment allows these groups to be able to create the conditions for them not to be the main victims of decisions taken by others. So the key word for me is empowerment. And empowerment means that you need to organize yourselves, fighting for that power, and at the same time that those that are in positions of responsibility need to understand that it is in the interest of everybody to have a society in which power is better distributed. So it's not a question of generosity of the men to have women in positions of high responsibility. It's a question of enlightened self-interest of us all to have gender parity in the way things are managed, to have the youth with a voice that influences decision-making and not only expresses, their wishes, and to have people with disability that represent probably more than 10% of the world population being actors of solutions that take into account their vulnerabilities to make sure that they are not the main victims of climate change and the other disasters that we face in the world. So, in my humble opinion, and probably because I've been in politics a large part of my life, the central question here is a question of power, and the most important battle you face is a battle for empowerment.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. We now open the floor for questions or comments. Please state your name and where you're from before stating your comment or your question. Okay, so the first hand. Could you please have a mic?
Yawe. Yawe, nadain teru komenga ngajuan pejugulen Marshall Island. Yawe, General Secretary. My name is Terry Komenga, and I am a student from the Republic of the Marshall Island. So the question is, what is your take or thoughts on nuclear legacy of the Pacific, which includes the nuclear storage in the Republic of the Marshall Island that is currently vulnerable due to...
Could you please repeat your question?
Okay, sorry. I'll repeat my question. What is your take or thoughts on nuclear legacy of the Pacific, which includes the nuclear storage in the Marshall Island that is currently vulnerable due to climate change and sea level rise? Thank you.
Well, the Pacific was victimized in the past, as we all know, because nuclear explosions as tests happened in, at least as much as I understand, both in French Polynesia and in the Marshall Islands. And the consequences of these have been quite dramatic in relation to health, in relation to poisoning of waters in some areas. And I've just been with the Prime Minister, the President of Marshall Islands, that is very worried because apparently there is a risk of leaking of radioactive materials that are contained in a kind of a coffin in the area. So, in my opinion, it is absolutely essential that non-proliferation is respected, that the nuclear treaties that were possible in the 20th century and that are now being put into question are maintained. And there was, as you know, a very important initiative by a number of countries, which is a convention on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. At the same time, I think that a lot needs to be done still in relation to the consequences of the explosions that took place, both in French Polynesia and in the Marshall Islands. And this, of course, has to do to the health consequences, to the impact on communities, to different other aspects. And, of course, there are questions of compensation, there are questions of mechanisms to allow for these impacts to be minimized as much as possible also in the future. So it is a question that has not yet been entirely resolved. President Hollande took a very courageous position, assuming the responsibility of France in relation to the explosions in the French Polynesia, and I spoke yesterday with the Prime Minister of the French Polynesia, and apparently there is a program of action that is now taking place by the local government together with the French government. The Marshall Islands, I think, are facing more difficulties, but again, this is something that I hope will never happen again, and the prohibition of nuclear tests is a fundamental element of our disarmament agenda.
We'll take a question from this side of the room, just behind.
No, I am Maori. My name is John Tokave, and I'm a student here at USP from the island of Rutuma here in Fiji. My question to the UN Secretary General is, how can Pacific youth get involved in your climate change summit in September?
Well, we will have the summit, which is an intergovernmental summit, on a Monday, but in the weekend there will be a number of events that will take place in which we intend to strongly involve the civil society, the youth. Our youth envoy is actively engaged in the preparation of it, but also the business community and the local authorities. Cities have a key role to play. We want all actors to be involved, and I believe that it will be possible also through our team here to see how people from this region can participate in the events that will be organized, exactly to allow for the civil society in general, and the youth in particular, to have a voice in the 2 days immediately before the summit where the heads of state will be intervening themselves. On the other hand, there is a number of coalitions that are taking place, and one important coalition is co-led by the Marshall Islands, and I think it's important that the interaction with the governments start immediately in relation to the preparation by governments themselves of the summit. And I would strongly encourage the youth in the Pacific to interact with the governments of the region in order to all the presidents and prime ministers will be there, I'm sure. So it's very important also that this dialogue takes place at a national level or at regional level.
Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary General. We've taken a comment from questions and comments from this. Can we take one from this section?
Malolele, my name is Daisy Piokala. I'm from the Kingdom of Tonga, and my question is, in your opinion, Secretary General, which group of people do you feel are the most vulnerable or affected by climate change, and why?
Well, I don't think there is one only specific group. It is clear that the population of several islands in the Pacific is particularly vulnerable, especially the atoll states. We have 4 atoll states in the world, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, and in the Indian Ocean, the Maldives. These, of course, the population of these islands is particularly vulnerable, and within these islands, of course, people with disability, people, indigenous people with less capacity to participate, or women not sufficiently empowered, are even more. But let's not forget what's happening, for instance, in the Sahel, where drought is progressing with a huge speed, and drought is facilitating conflict and is facilitating the work of terrorist groups. So the population of African countries affected by drought is now also extremely vulnerable. And again, in these communities that are vulnerable, women in particular, young people in particular, people with disability are even more vulnerable. So we have a number of situations in the world where you have regions, countries, or areas that are particularly impacted. And within those areas, you have, depending on the social structure of the countries we are involved, we have social groups that are particularly vulnerable. Our obligation is, in all our adaptation strategies, to do everything possible in order to minimize the negative impact on those most vulnerable groups. And this, again, relates to the need to empower those groups for their voice to be heard when adaptation policies are defined.
Thank you.
I'm very sorry. Due to time constraints, we'll have to close the discussion, but thank you very much.
One more.
One more. Okay. Eagerly. Wait, so one more. Yeah.
Hi. Hola, estimado Guterres. Mi nombre es Akmal. I work for the Pacific Islands Association of NGOs, and it's an honor to have you here. So it is a regional umbrella organization in 27 Pacific Island countries and territories. So I've been working with people in the area of climate change, especially from Kiribati, Fiji, Marshall Islands, and Tuvalu. And say, I want to relay this message to you. The Pacific does not want charity. The Pacific wants dignity. Because for more than 10,000 years, the Pacific has navigated the oceans of the Pacific. We know our oceans, we know our lands, and we know we have survived. So valuing traditional knowledge and dignity more than anything is what the Pacific needs. And going further in terms of dignity, sir, while we are talking about climate change and climate action, half of the Pacific is still a territory to some colonialist country. And say, I'm sure you have heard about the human rights abuses, the gross human rights abuses and conduct in West Papua. So is there any plans by the UN to go in and to do an independent investigation on the gross misviolation of human rights in the West Papua? Thank you very much.
Well, I would like to focus on one specific area, because there are many areas in the world where we have serious problems of human rights. You have a High Commissioner for Human Rights that has been quite active in most of these situations. We have the Human Rights Council, in which these situations can be discussed. We have rapporteurs that can go to different countries and present reports that then are discussed either by the Human Rights Council or by the General Assembly of the United Nations. And so this is an area where the UN system has a number of avenues in which those that suffer the violations of human rights can have a voice and can make the United Nations system act when that is possible. But we have some buts here. For instance, if you need, for any reason, that the Security Council takes a decision, and we know that in the Security Council there are vetoes, and sometimes a decision that would be important to create conditions for human rights not to be systematically violated in an area might find a veto in the Security Council, and the UN then cannot act. So nothing is perfect, and the UN system is also not perfect.
One last. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Daniel Graf. I attend International School Suva. Mr. Secretary General, you have said again in the last few days while touring our region that the world is not on track to combat climate change, so we need to get it back on track and continue to focus on prevention. However, do you also see the danger that more and more resources are invested in adaptation and mitigation methods, thus taking the focus off the fight of global warming beyond the target of 1.5 to 2 degrees, and instead resigning to believe that the worst case scenarios are likely and we now need to adapt? Thank you.
One of the central questions of the summit and of the decisions on 2020 is exactly financing. In relation to financing, we are having some successes. For instance, the World Bank has just decided to double their amounts for climate action from 200 billion to 400 billion US dollars in 5 years, and to have 50 for mitigation and 50 for adaptation. Because one of the reasons why we were worried was that there would be a lot of concentration of funds in mitigation, but not in adaptation. And for the developing world, adaptation is essential, because unfortunately, climate change is already there. It's not something for the end of the century. It's here, and the impacts are now. And we need to make sure that, the impacts are now in such a way that I'm going to Tuvalu tomorrow, and there is a problem to know at what time I can land, because the runway is now completely full of water. The climate change is now. It's not something for the future. The impact is already here. So we need a much stronger commitment to adaptation. We are working on that. I appointed the President of France, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, and the Emir of Qatar to lead an international effort to guarantee that the promise of the 100 billion per year from 2020 onwards that was made in Paris materializes. And again, as I said, for mitigation and climate change for the developing world, for mitigation and adaptation to the developing world. And this battle is absolutely essential, because without resources, it will be impossible to do the investments that in some aspects are massive, to build resilience of countries, resilience of communities, to be able to suffer the impacts of climate change with the minimum cost for the people, especially for the most vulnerable people.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. I'm getting signals from all over to wrap up. So we are honored to have you here. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you all for being here. We're going to have a quick photo op before the Secretary General leaves. So if you could all stand where you are, and we'll take a photo from the front with the Secretary General. Yes. Stand where you are. Oh, yes. So please stand where you are. Oh, everyone, please remain in the room. The Secretary General will be moved to his next engagement, and then we will open the exit at the top.
So start taking your photo.